4 days before Christmas in 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 fell in pieces from the night sky, plummeting to the ground at over 800 kilometers an hour. The wing section landed on a house in the small Scottish town of Lockerbie and erupted into a massive fireball, carving out a vast crater and killing 11 Lockerbie residents. The aircraft's 259 passengers and crew were all killed.
There obviously are a number of potential causes for an in-flight breakup. We are looking for evidence to try and point us in the right direction. To suggest that it would be one or the other at this stage would be wrong.
The ensuing investigation was led by the local constabulary, the smallest police force in Britain, with backing from other British forces as well as the FBI. As feared, the disaster was no accident, but the result of a bomb concealed in a radio within a suitcase. The bomb detonated in the forward cargo hold and easily tore through the aluminium baggage container, causing massive damage that broke the plane apart. How that bomb got on board was a key issue, raising questions of baggage security and prompting calls for bomb-resistant containers. 2 Libyan nationals were indicted for murder, precipitating a lengthy standoff with Libya and its famous leader, Colonel Gaddafi. The investigation into the Lockerbie disaster was an arduous 3-year quest for answers. A painstaking and painful process for investigators, families of the victims, and for the residents of Lockerbie. Their picturesque, innocent town had been touched by evil and would never be the same again. Just a 90-minute car trip from Edinburgh and Glasgow, Lockerbie is a picturesque rural town set in the Scottish lowlands, with a population of around 4,000 people. It's steeped in history, possibly dating as far back as the Roman days, and certainly to the 10th century, and the Vikings who named it Lockie's Village in Old Norse. It's the kind of place where it's difficult to believe anything bad could happen, or at least it was, until the cold winter's night in December 1988.
I couldn't make out what the noise was because it wasn't the sound of a jet engine, a high-pitched whine of a jet engine. It was thunder, you know, real thunder. I could see the rounded ends of the wing, both ends of the wing, you know, and I could see the full V, and it was joined in the middle. After the flame went up from that crashing, there were black objects. Now, they were not distinguishable as such, but one of the things looked like a row of seats, you know, 3 seats or something joined together, and they were coming down more or less over the top of us. Also in the flame, I could see a door panel, a silver shape of a door panel, and that was fluttering down just like an autumn leaf, you know. Well, that's right above my head, at which point I decided that I better get under cover.
When the bomb exploded, the damage caused the cone of the plane to separate from the main fuselage. It hit the ground near a church in the village of Tundergarth, 4 kilometers east of Lockerbie. It later emerged that many of the passengers and crew were still alive when the plane hit the ground. Some even briefly survived the impact.
It was this huge fireball in the sky, bright orange, and it was brilliant light and warm because I had my sleeves rolled up, and it was really warm to my arms and my face. You could feel the heat from it. There was droplets coming from that brilliant light and dropping on the street and on the roofs of the houses and bursting into flames. But when we looked into the fuselage area, then we saw the full horror of the extent as to what the disaster was about. They were still lying there, tied into their seats, some tied into their seats, some lying just out in the open. And this was just by torchlight.
The main fuselage of the plane was like a tin can with both ends open. Gale force winds surged through, throwing people, sucking the air from their lungs and the clothes from their bodies. Any person or object not strapped down was at the mercy of the winds, and many people were blown out of the plane into Arctic temperatures and a nightmare 2-minute freefall. The falling fuselage broke apart, the fuel-filled wings landing first and obliterating 3 houses. One boy was at a neighbor's when he saw his home erupt into a fireball, killing his parents and sister. The impact of the wings forged a huge crater, displacing 1,500 tons of material and rupturing a gas line that fed the fire. 2 other houses at the epicenter were effectively vaporized, and all traces of the 10 passengers in the section above the wing were gone. Quite simply, nothing was left. Many houses were destroyed, gutted by fire or damaged beyond repair. The intense heat melted cast iron gates in surrounding streets and scorched cars on the nearby A74 motorway. Residents were confronted with the horror of hundreds of bodies, sometimes in clusters, 60 by the golf course, and a section of fuselage with 50 bodies fell in one woman's garden.
The people from the area, in particular Lockerbie, were explaining the carnage and what was taking place. I actually saw it and lived through it, as I keep saying, for the most intense days of my life. So I could empathize with them regarding what they were going through and what they still go through today.
At this moment, at this exact moment, what you see is what happened on the ground to the people of Lockerbie. And it happened to them too. It didn't just happen to the people who came out of the sky, like my daughter, but it happened to the people on the ground too. And it's a terrible thing.
Despite their own losses and confronted with horrific sights all around them, the people of Lockerbie showed extraordinary resilience. Bodies could not be removed until they were examined and remained, sometimes for days, in the streets, parks, and in people's gardens. But the locals understood. They welcomed grieving relatives, providing cups of tea, sandwiches, and a sympathetic ear, forming lasting bonds with these, the other living victims. The Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary was the local police force in charge of the investigation. Being the smallest force in Britain, it received extensive support from other police, soldiers, and investigative workers. Although this was a Scottish operation on Scottish territory, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher committed British finance and resources to the costly operation. The impact areas all had to be thoroughly searched for bodies and evidence of any kind. Over 1,000 police and soldiers systematically worked for months, often on hands and knees, feeling with their fingers, investigating everything. 10,000 items were picked up, tagged, bagged, and labelled, then taken to Lockerbie's high school, where the gymnasium had been converted into a testing facility. Items were x-rayed and checked for explosive residue, and the results recorded.
We did have a list of people missing from that particular area. This morning we thought, well, what else is there for us to do? When suddenly Mr. Wilson walked in and said, Mrs. Nielsen's homeless, at which point everyone, I think, gave us a lift this morning, and everyone felt this was absolutely marvellous to be able to cross one off the list that we have.
The aircraft, which had once proudly carried the name clipper made of the seas had shattered into fragments, and these were scattered throughout the township and all over the countryside, lighter material even reaching the east coast of England. Investigators were lowered into the cockpit, the dead crew still in place. They observed that everything was normal. The crew had no indication of an emergency. Oxygen masks were still in place, and instruments were set to cruise at an altitude of 31,000 feet. The densely forested areas around the town were surveyed with infrared cameras, and the British military flew helicopters over the crash zones, pinpointing large pieces of wreckage for the ground crews to work on. Every single component of the aircraft was painstakingly inspected, gathered, and taken away so that whatever still existed could be reassembled in an attempt to understand how this disaster had unfolded. By now, the fingertip search of the sites had turned up several pieces of a suitcase, which appeared to have received major, close-range explosive damage. Further discoveries of blast-affected electronic components increased speculation that this was a bomb attack. In 103's final moments, a flight controller saw its single radar return become 4, and then several, fanning out as the plane broke up. Cockpit data later showed that within 8 seconds, the wreckage had spread over almost 2 kilometers of airspace.
What sort of evidence would point the investigators towards concluding that a bomb had caused this crash?
They would get evidence from the medical forensic scientists who would examine the bodies. They would be X-raying those bodies to look for small shrapnel particles embedded in them. They would be looking for high-intensity flash burns on those bodies. If they found any of those things, they should be able to locate from the seat numbers of the individual concerned where he was sitting, and from the angle of penetration of shrapnel, they could isolate down to a fairly small area where the explosion originally took place.
Investigators established that the bomb detonated in the forward section of the aircraft, gouging out a 20-centimeter wide hole and causing the skin of the fuselage to peel off. This theory evolved after extensive examination of all the recovered components and then careful reconstruction of part of the fuselage. This area, the forward cargo hold, had held several baggage containers made of either fiber or aluminium. The cargo loading plan showed which were near the explosion point, and 2 showed signs of blackening and damage consistent with an explosion. These containers were reassembled, and investigators found that the aluminium container had been the origin of the explosion, causing secondary damage to the fiber container. Particularly since Lockerbie, interest has grown in bomb-resistant baggage containers.
If you're able to limit the additional expense that a passenger ultimately will have to pay on his ticket because these containers are being used, then I don't think there can be any excuse for airlines not going ahead with them.
I firmly believe that if these containers had been available at the time of Lockerbie, my daughter would still be alive.
Bomb-resistant baggage containers do exist, used in high-risk situations long before Lockerbie. The containers, however, are heavy and costly. Their added weight reduces the aircraft's carrying capacity and therefore revenue. Many airlines opt for just 1 or 2, using them for cargo they think might be suspect.
A number of the sweeping criticisms that were made of Pan American and its subsidiaries about its organization and about aspects of its security arrangements were really quite unjustified.
Since Lockerbie and 9/11, airlines have spent billions on security, introducing sophisticated and often invasive screening, but still, there are no guarantees.
We did indeed receive on December 9th an based on an untested source in terms of reliability, That information was disseminated throughout this embassy, and we advised all appropriate British authorities, including all American carriers.
What was the source?
It was an unidentified caller that apparently made a phone call to our embassy in Helsinki.
The US alerted other embassies, its own departments, and all relevant airlines, including Pan Am. The alert meant 103's empty seats were sold cheaply. 48 students were heading home to the US from overseas study. Several families with babies and young children were on board, the youngest just 2 months old. Although there was compelling information linking this terrorist attack with extremist Palestinians or Syrians, America rejected this, instead directing attention to Libya. For some time, Libya had been an irritant to America, flexing its muscles in the Arab world. Now it was accused of being behind the Lockerbie mass murder, with 2 of its intelligence operatives named as responsible. Despite the threat of sanctions, Libya refused to hand the suspects over for trial.
It was Megrahi working in concert with others, as well as working for Libyan intelligence. And I think what we've been asking for is a reinstatement of sanctions against Libya. We asked them to renounce terrorism. And I personally also believe that by saying Libyan intelligence was involved, that Muammar Gaddafi is personally responsible.
We are engaged in a long-term struggle against terrorism, in which we will use every means, including diplomatic, economic, and force where necessary, to hold terrorists accountable and to protect American lives.
Attention focused on the suitcase in which the bomb had exploded and some clothing which had been wrapped around the bomb. Clothing labels led investigators to Malta, where shopkeeper Tony Gauci gave several conflicting statements, and despite confusion, identified Abd al-Basset Ali al-Magrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer, as the purchaser of the clothing and a Samsonite suitcase. Also indicted was Lamine Khalifa Fahima, a former Libyan Arab Airlines manager at Lua Malta International Airport, where on December 21st, an unaccompanied bag was checked in and tagged for forwarding to Frankfurt. With its official airline tag, it would automatically then be forwarded to London.
We now challenge Libya to turn promises into deeds. The suspects should be surrendered for trial promptly. We call upon the members of organizations that have endorsed this approach to urge Libya to end its 10 years of evasion now.
Negotiations between South African President Nelson Mandela and Colonel Gaddafi, together with the UN's offer to drop trade sanctions, resulted in an agreement for the 2 Libyans to be tried under Scottish law in the Netherlands.
We are happy to be able to announce that positive results were achieved in these discussions and that common understanding was reached on all the outstanding matters or issues on this matter. This was made possible by the sincere cooperation of Colonel Gaddafi.
In April 1999, the 2 Libyans were taken into Dutch custody, indicted on 270 counts of murder and other charges. The investigation into Lockerbie had taken 3 years, and the trial in May 2000 was to be one of Britain's largest, calling hundreds of witnesses and exhibits at a cost of £80 million. Evidence was to be that of the shopkeeper and a piece of circuit board found weeks after the crash. This was said to be part of the detonator, triggering the deadly blast that took 270 lives. It was the single most important piece of evidence in the prosecution's case. After all these years, families of Lockerbie's victims now wanted answers and some final closure. The victims of Lockerbie were many. 400 parents lost a son or daughter. One couple's son was killed less than a year after their daughter died, leaving them childless. Another 44 parents lost their only child. 140 children lost a parent, 7 were made orphans. Nothing would take this pain away, but the families wanted to see justice done.
I'm feeling extremely nervous. We're about to hear what the judges feel.
The trial fell short of expectations and still remains controversial, with allegations of perjury, paid testimony, and planted evidence. Whether the terrorists were Libyan, Palestinian, or other extremists remains in question. Fihima was not found guilty. Al-Megrahi was given a life sentence, with a minimum of 20 years.
It doesn't feel like the end because there are so many unanswered questions, and we have always said we wanted a full inquiry.
With the verdict in, families were frustrated that only one man would pay, when the chain of command must have gone much higher. There was no official intention of going any further.
Many said it would not happen, but we have shown that it can happen.
This man was found guilty of murdering 270 people. 20 years is less than a month per victim, and somehow that doesn't sit right with me.
Nothing could ever right such a wrong. 270 people were killed in a most callous, cold-blooded act, leaving those who loved them in a limbo of grief and despair.
Lockerbie will always be synonymous with disaster. We can't help that. That was through no fault of our own. We were catapulted into the world headlines. But we feel that our raison d'etre, if you like, to be in Lockerbie is to look after the relatives when they come here. We stand behind them.
Everybody's, the whole town, everybody's been very helpful. The town itself is going through a major trauma, and, everyone's just been fantastic. Everybody's helping everybody else.
Decades later, Lockerbie's people still open their hearts to the families who regularly return. Yet they refuse to dwell on their tragedy, working hard to restore normality and optimism.
I think each year at Christmas will be the anniversary of this disaster. People will relive the sadness and the horror of everything they've been through.
In a peaceful rural town, Lockerbie's people witnessed violence, death, and destruction that could only be compared to living in a war zone. Bodies burnt beyond recognition, a dead baby in the branches of a tree, a young girl draped over a picket fence, seemingly asleep. You don't forget things like that, but you learn to live with the memories and somehow cope. But there would always be that lingering if only. What if greater attention had been paid to the warnings? Could this have been avoided?
They did receive a warning that told them almost the week, the flight, the company it was going on, and a radio on which the bomb was put, and yet they didn't do anything effectively to prevent that terrible tragedy.
In 2009, the terminally ill Al-Megrahi was released amid much controversy. Lockerbie remains a raw wound, one of the most shocking terrorist acts, killing people from 21 nations, 179 from America. This crime and its many victims will long live in people's memories.
The daily flow of morning rush hour in London is a constant. Thousands flock to the underground and bus lines, a predictable and guaranteed routine, rarely interrupted. Yet it was this reliability that unknowingly made Londoners a target in a well-planned and coordinated terrorist attack on innocent people as they set about their normal lives. London is no stranger to bomb threats, having endured the IRA tension, yet this sinister and calculated attack that killed 52 people and injured 700 was a crisis that left London and the world reeling in disbelief. On the morning of July 7, 2005, 4 Al-Qaeda suicide bombers detonated 3 bombs on London Underground trains in quick succession, and the 4th an hour later on a double-decker bus. All 4 bombers died in the explosions. The handmade bombs they carried were crude yet highly effective devices made from organic peroxide they had packed into their rucksacks. The attack prompted a massive response from emergency services, and in the immediate aftermath, brought the city to a standstill, as London's public transport system was forced to almost completely shut down. As sense came out of the chaos, it was soon revealed that the bombers were motivated by the teachings of Osama bin Laden. The terrorist attack they had launched was to show they were opposed to Britain's support of Saudi Arabia and Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. It was an event that devastated London and its people, but it did not break their spirit. After the September 11 Twin Towers attack in New York in 2001, many of the world's countries rallied together to form a united front, one they called the War on Terror. At the time of the London bombings, Prime Minister Tony Blair had 8,500 troops still in Iraq. Their presence was part of the overall political aim to establish a stable democracy in Iraq, promote peace between Israel and Palestine, and democratic reform elsewhere in the Middle East. A terrorist attack did not change the government's resolve. United States and UK forces began a military campaign in Iraq in 2003, where Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was believed to be harboring weapons of mass destruction and supporting the Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. The world had been on high alert since the unprecedented 9/11 attack in New York, and London was assumed to be at risk. Although tighter security since the World Trade Center attack would have prevented a more devastating attack, it could not stop this one. It was 8:50 in the morning on a Thursday when 3 bombs exploded within 50 seconds of each other. The first just outside Liverpool Street Station, the second near Edgware Road Station, and the third on a southbound Piccadilly line between King's Cross and Russell Square. About an hour later, when people thought the worst was over, the final explosion was on a double-decker bus in Tavistock Square, not far from King's Cross. The blast killed 13 and left more than 100 injured. The bus was running off its normal route at the time of the explosion, as its usual route along Euston Road had been closed because of the tube bombing between King's Cross and Russell Square. The explosion ripped the roof off the top deck of the vehicle and destroyed the back of the bus, leaving the front intact. The force of the explosion made it difficult to work out the death toll and whether the bomber was among the dead. In the aftermath, a large area was cordoned off and searched while forensic teams combed the area for clues. It was almost impossible to absorb the magnitude of the disaster as people tried to piece together what had happened. Many of those travelling on the bus were trying to escape the travel chaos sparked by the earlier tube blasts. Chaos and confusion reigned as emergency services were pushed to their limits, trying to administer help to the injured underground as well as those above.
The bus is a bomb that has gone off in the back of the upper part of a bus, so that's all I'm going to say at the moment.
There's some suggestion it could have been a suicide bomber?
There's no reason to suggest that, there's no reason to deny that. It's just, you know, there is not enough information at this stage to make that a fact, and I think speculation to that is unhelpful.
And from what you've seen, these various incidents all very, very close together. Was this a coordinated attack?
Again, it's too early to tell, but one has to operate on a working assumption that that is the fact.
The bus happened to be outside the British Medical Association when the bomb was detonated, so doctors, surgeons and medical practitioners were able to quickly give emergency care to the injured. Emergency services arrived at the Tavistock scene more quickly than the 3 underground blasts, mainly because they were already in the area. Police officers that had been manning cordons in Euston Road ran the short distance to the scene when they heard the bang. The bomber is later identified as Asib Hussein, 18 years old.
The band, when you hear the band, the people in my bus start running from the top down the stair of the bus. Everybody's shouting, running, oh God, what's happening? Whoa, whoa, let's get out of the bus, shouting like that. So we start running as well, and we continue running all the time.
The mangled wreckage of the bus showed the force of the blast as it lay peeled open in the street.
You could still see the top of the bus was blowing off, and there was debris all over the street. And people were just panicked on their cell phones trying to get a hold of their loved ones.
The fortunate were reunited, a glimmer of relief in a tragic scene. The London transport system was forced into lockdown because of the complete closure of the underground system and some bus networks. All services were suspended, which forced thousands of people to seek alternative transport. As waves of people left the underground, most shocked and in disbelief, many chose to walk home or make their way to the next zone, bus or train station. By the next day, most of the underground was back functioning, yet many chose not to go to work that day.
And then there was a huge bang, flash, and then the train came to a grinding halt, and filled with acrid smoke and dust. But amazingly, there was no panic. Everyone remained very calm and sensible.
Victims of the blasts were treated for shock and smoke inhalation by paramedics on the scene.
I was on the carriage, there was a huge explosion in my carriage. Smoke filled the place, train stopped, darkness everywhere, people screaming. We were all sort of panicking because of the smoke as well, we didn't know what had happened, so a few of us kicked down one of the doors, and were sort of thinking about jumping down, but we didn't know if the tracks were still alive or not.
While victims began arriving at the Royal London Hospital for further treatment, others were reunited amid the crowds and confusion. Throughout the day, there was a constant stream of ambulances taking the injured to hospitals, the dead to morgues.
Suddenly, it was a massive explosion, really big. People screamed, lights went out in all the carriages, it was filled with smoke, and everything just went deadly silent for a few seconds. People didn't know what the hell had happened. There was a pregnant woman on the tube.
Eventually everyone starts collecting themselves and trying to stay low and cover their faces. And we hear a woman screaming. I couldn't really tell which way it was from, but everyone sort of saying, calm down, you know, like sort of, you're not helping. But obviously, by the sounds of it, she must have been in a carriage full of bodies or something.
Doctors and medical help rushed to the aid of the injured with supplies and bandages as they headed underground to treat the wounded. Yet a catastrophe of this magnitude meant emergency services were stretched to breaking point. Many of the wounded were transported to nearby hospitals on buses, the quickest and most effective method of transport. Police blocked off streets and directed traffic in an attempt to allow ambulances and treatment through to help the injured. both underground, in the tube, and above ground at Tavistock. Stunned disbelief is etched in the faces of those who have been injured and those who have witnessed the tragedy. As emergency workers work with the speed and urgency to administer help, those surviving are dazed and confused at the horror and fear they have just witnessed.
Just travelling along and just the train made an almighty stop, an almighty bang. Things went dark there for a second and so much smoke, and people panicking. And then people started to calm down. People wanted to get to the back of the train away from the danger area, but there was nowhere for them to go. And then they took us off the train and made us walk all the way back past it all. Dead bodies on the tracks, train blown open.
Air ambulances were also used to lift the wounded away from the bombed areas.
The plans that we worked on so hard were required today. And as far as that response is concerned, the response worked extremely well. But it's a very sad day that we had to actually bring this into play.
Roads became blocked and emergency service access to the bombing sites became hampered. Radio and communication was hampered also by the sheer volume of emergency calls. This was further complicated because mobile phone networks were temporarily down during the day. It made an already chaotic situation worse. Emergency services were prepared for potential attacks, yet the scope and circumstances of the bombings was unprecedented.
With this level of resource, it allows us to actually treat people with the sort of interventions that you would normally get in a hospital or an intensive care unit. Some patients received potent painkillers and some of them were put on life support machines actually at the scene.
Those who were mobile and without life-threatening injuries were helped into waiting ambulances and taken to hospitals throughout London. Others were transported on stretchers. Hospitals had been put on full alert and were only giving priority to those injured in the blasts. Of the 700 injured, 100 needed overnight treatment or more. It was a constant and seemingly never-ending process to get survivors life-saving treatment.
The injuries are mostly burn injuries with bony deformities, bony injuries associated with blast. All of that group, I think, also have airway problems in that there are burn injuries to the airways.
Emergency vehicles and ambulances lined the streets. Others weaved their way through the mayhem, transporting as many injured as possible to treatment. It was distressing and exhausting work. This was the deadliest single act of terrorism in the United Kingdom since the Lockerbie bombing, which killed 270, and the deadliest bombing in the UK since World War II.
They're coming in with fragmentation injury, with tattooing of their skins, with inhalation injury, with limb injury. Basically, the characteristic injury of a terrorist incident is multiple injuries to multiple body systems.
I want to express my admiration for the people of our capital city who, in the aftermath of yesterday's bombings, are calmly determined to resume their normal lives. That is the answer to this outrage. But those who perpetrate these brutal acts against innocent people should know that they will not change our way of life. Atrocities such as these simply reinforce our sense of community, our humanity, and our trust in the rule of law.
Her Royal Highness the Queen visited the Royal London Hospital the day after the bombings, meeting emergency staff who responded to the attacks and some of the injured. She expressed her sympathy to all of those affected by the bombings and the relatives of those killed and injured as well, and praised the emergency services staff and their role.
All of a sudden, boom, I was knocked out cold and I didn't even know what had happened. I just realised that something was wrong and I asked myself, am I dead?
You know, I saw this silver lines across my face, which I believe was the glass, and this yellow flash, and then I was being twisted and thrown to the ground. I had no idea what happened. There was a rushing sound and there was just total darkness.
We just pulled out Edgware Road, and next thing I know, there's a large flash of light. Felt a burning sensation on my hands, put my hands up to my face. I was on the floor by that point. Yeah, I can't recall anything prior to that, any noise, any bang.
Following the bombings, the United Kingdom and other countries held gatherings to honour the dead and missing. Most of these were a minute's silence, candlelit vigils and the laying of flowers at the bombing sites. The day after the bombing, the Union Jack was ordered to be flown at half-mast, and other countries and embassies ordered the same. Thousands attend a vigil at Trafalgar Square, where people were urged not to be angry, but let courage unite the country in its grief.
I have watched this city transformed in my lifetime as a beacon about what the world can be, and I hope and pray will be. It is a city that embraces change, and it is a city which is the most tolerant in the world. Those who came here to kill last Thursday had many goals, but one was that we should turn on each other like animals trapped in a cage, and they failed. They failed totally and utterly. There may be places in the world where still that would have happened, but not here.
Flowers were laid at the scene of the bombings as a mark of respect for the 52 British citizens who died and the 700 who were injured. The people of London showed their solidarity and spirit of strength in the face of the carefully coordinated suicide attacks on the London public transport system, an attack which had shook the country to its core. It did not take long until investigations traced the steps of the 4 suicide bombers and revealed their identity.
We've already collected 2,500 CCTV tapes. We have 2,000 calls to the anti-terrorist hotline. We've had 115,000 calls to the Casualty Bureau. You know, we will do all of it, and we will do it right, and we will do it meticulously. These people will be caught.
This collection of information swiftly led investigators to raids on 6 properties in the Leeds area, only 5 days after the bombings. In these raids, 1 man is arrested. The following day, 2 more houses are raided. Police later revealed explosive material was found in the Leeds property, and also explosives found in the vehicle of one of the bombers at the Luton railway station. It is a thorough investigation, and one that leads to the families of those accused of the bombing, including the uncle of the Tavistock bomber.
It's killing me every day. Every day it's killing me. It's my nephew, and that's killing me every day.
Bashir Ahmed, the uncle of the Aldgate suicide bomber Shazad Tanweer, is pursued by the media to his vehicle.
We do know that he'd been to Pakistan. You said he'd been taking part in religious studies out there,
Yes,
and
sir.
that was very recently, yes?
That's very recent.
That was
yeah.
the end of last year and
That's
the beginning of this year.
That's the end of last year, beginning of this year. That's the end of his life by look of it.
Did you see any change in him when you came back?
Nope.
The Bashir family now is at the mercy of the media because of the act of their nephew, and they feel they can no longer live in London.
This has been a most terrible and tragic atrocity that has cost many innocent lives. It is through terrorism that the people that have committed this terrible act express their values. And it's right at this moment that we demonstrate ours. I think we all know what they're trying to do. They're trying to use the slaughter of innocent people to cow us, to frighten us out of doing the things that we want to do, of trying to stop us going about our business as normal as we're entitled to do. And they should not and they must not succeed. When they try to intimidate us, we will not be intimidated. When they seek to change our country or our way of life by these methods, we will not be changed. When they try to divide our people or weaken our resolve, we will not be divided and our resolve will hold firm. We will show by our spirit and dignity, and by a quiet but true strength that there is in the British people, that our values will long outlast theirs. The purpose of terrorism is just that. It is to terrorize people, and we will not be terrorized.
This mangled wreckage of an aeroplane shot down over Kigali, Rwanda, was a single act of terrorism that ignited ethnic tension between the Hutus and the Tutsis and spearheaded 100 days of unprecedented savage and merciless killing. With the assassination of Hutu Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana, Hutus sought a bloodthirsty revenge on the minority Tutsis and their supporters. Within hours of the president's death, the genocide began, a frenzied campaign of mayhem that left more than 800,000 people, regardless of age or gender, systematically slain. Roadblocks were set up preventing Tutsis escaping, but most were murdered in their own villages and homes. And with guns and grenades scarce, most were murdered with machetes.
There's an awful lot of shooting going on right now, and it's not just in one place, it's in every place that I can see or hear, and it's very heavy gunfire, and basically it seems like they haven't got tired yet. They're still going at it.
The grim sight of thousands of bodies littered the countryside and the streets.
This is a real form of racialism. People are being identified according to physical characteristics and massacred by machete, including this terrible incident in the Centre of Spirituality in Kigali, where a number of church personnel was slaughtered, and of course the Prime Minister and a number of other ministers.
The presence of UN forces did nothing to quell the violence.
We're all late. We're already weeks and weeks late.
Ethnic tension between the Hutus and minority Tutsis had always simmered and often erupted in Rwanda, but tensions escalated in 1990 when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, a group mainly made up of the Tutsi refugees, invaded northern Rwanda to try and overthrow the Hutu-led government. This offensive sparked the Rwandan Civil War, a battle between the Hutu regime, supported by the French-speaking nations of Africa and France, fighting against the RPF, Tutsi refugees supported by Uganda. Tension between the two groups was at a critical point, with many Hutus gathering force behind Hutu power. Because of fierce fighting between the two groups, French and Zaire troops were sent in to help the Hutu government to try and maintain peace. A ceasefire was signed in March 1991, and the RPF guerrillas retreated to the mountains to the north. And while the Rwandan army trained and armed civilian militia, the RPF launched a new offensive and reached the outskirts of Kigali. French forces were called in and fighting continued for several months. After months of negotiation in August 1993, the rebels and the government of Rwanda signed the Arusha Accords peace treaty, a treaty which allowed for the return of refugees and a coalition Hutu RPF government. However, as leader of the Hutu Coalition for the Defense of the Republic, CDR, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana later stalled on setting up the power-sharing government. In August, UN Commander Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire made a reconnaissance trip to Rwanda for a peacekeeping mission. The peacekeeping mission unraveled into a debacle as the United Nations established the United Nations Assistant Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, in October to help implement the Arusha Accord and put an end to the Rwandan Civil War. However, this peacekeeping mission soon was frustrated by its rules of engagement, and the approved 2,500 personnel took 5 months of piecemeal commitments to reach its level. The UNAMIR aim of helping form a transitional government was delayed by squabbling between the parties, and when President Habyarimana was inaugurated in January 1994, violent clashes followed. Nothing could prepare Rwanda or the world for the incomprehensible genocide that was triggered by the assassination of Rwandan President and Burundi President Cyprien Ntaryamira on April 6, 1994. That night, the killing began. Rwanda's history has been turbulent for centuries, and in the early 1900s, Belgian colonists turned the traditional Hutu-Tutsi relationship in the colony of Rwanda-Urundi into a class system favouring the minority Tutsis over the Hutus. In the late 1950s, the Hutus formed the Hutu Emancipation Movement, rebelling against the Belgian colonial power and Tutsi elite, resulting in 150,000 Tutsis fleeing to Burundi. In the 1960s, the Hutus restored their power by winning elections organised by the Belgian colonial rulers. In 1962, Belgium withdraws, leaving Rwanda and Burundi as two independent countries. Following the withdrawal of Belgian colonial rulers, a bloody Hutu revolution left in its wake the horror of massacred Tutsis, and for those that managed to survive the bloodshed, the prospect of fleeing their homeland for nearby states. The aftermath of this conflict saw a new president installed, Gregor Kayibanda, yet fighting continued. Under this new regime, the Tutsis, especially those previously in power, were ruthlessly persecuted. Many of the educated flee the country seeking refuge in nearby Uganda and other areas in nearby Burundi. The Tutsis retain their power. In 1963, more attacks and massacres of Tutsis took place, this time in response to military attacks by Tutsis in Burundi. Once again, Tutsi refugees were forced to leave their homeland. By July 1973, General Juvenal Habyarimana seized power, promising to restore order. He set up a one-party state with a policy of ethnic quotas in all public service jobs, with Tutsis restricted to 9% of all jobs. On April 7, 1994, the day after President Habyarimana's assassination, the Rwandan armed forces and the Interahamwe Hutu militia set up roadblocks and systematically went from house to house, killing Tutsis and moderate Hutu politicians. Mayhem and confusion reign as thousands die in the carnage on the first day, some by gunshot, but most by the brutal slaying with a machete. Tutsi are slain while fleeing to save their lives. UN forces stand helplessly by while the slaughter unfolds around them. They have been forbidden to intervene, as this would breach their monitoring mandate. On day 2 of the slaughter, the Rwandan Patriotic Front launched a major offensive to end the genocide and rescue 600 of its troops surrounded in Kigali. Its troops had been stationed there as part of the Arusha Accords. In desperation, Tutsis tried to escape the impending slaughter by the Hutu militia and bands of Hutu civilians that had been incited to join the killings. The militia and civilians were on the move as the systematic murder of Tutsis, regardless of age or gender, was underway. While the UN-led UNAMIR was based in Kigali escorting Tutsis, they were unable to stop the Hutus from escalating their attacks elsewhere. After UN personnel were attacked, Lieutenant General Dallaire cabled New York, detailing the killings of politicians and peacekeepers, and informing the UN that the violent campaign was well organised, deliberate, and undertaken by the Presidential Guard. Amid the rising confusion, a Rwandan television report accused Belgian peacekeepers of being involved in the president's assassination. This report has since been directly linked to the killing of 10 Belgian UN troops by Rwandan army soldiers. The Hotel de Mille Collines in Kigali became an unlikely haven for thousands of refugees fleeing the murder squads. The hotel manager kept the Hutu militia at bay by bribing them with money and alcohol and providing the refugees holed up inside with food and water, salvaged from the hotel swimming pool. Word of the violence and killings began to spread around the globe, with Care International in the UK becoming involved.
There's an awful lot of shooting going on right now, and it's not just in one place, it's in every place that I can see or hear, and it's very heavy gunfire, and basically it seems like they haven't gotten tired yet. They're still going at it.
It sounds like the fighting is carrying on as intense as ever, as random as ever, and completely wildly. The ray of hope at the moment is that there is apparently a convoy is going to leave the city tomorrow morning early. It's a test convoy which has been organised by the US Embassy there. And they have apparently managed to negotiate somehow, the UN and the Rwandan army. They've negotiated some kind of safe passage out of the city. Whether or not it actually works out is another question.
The horror of this genocide became apparent on April 9, when UN observers witnessed the ruthless massacre of innocent children at a Polish church in Kikondo by the Hutu militia. They watched helplessly as the carnage unfolded. On the same day, 1,000 heavily armed and trained European troops arrived to escort European civilian personnel out of the country. The news story was picked up by the world media when the Washington Post reported on the execution of Rwandan employees of relief agencies in front of their expatriate colleagues. On April 21, the UN cut its forces from 2,500 to 250, following the brutal murder of 10 Belgian soldiers guarding moderate Hutu Prime Minister Agathe Uwilingiyimana. The Prime Minister was killed and the Belgians disarmed, tortured and hacked to death. Their instructions from UN Force Commander had been not to resist violently, as this would have breached their mandate. By early July, the Rwandan Patriotic Front had captured Kigali, and the Hutu government fled to Zaire, followed by a tide of refugees. Troops from neutral countries were building, but this was no defence against high explosives. Civilian workers and their children thought that here they were safe. Troops carrying small arms were outgunned and virtually defenceless. Dallaire rushed back to rally his men and briefed them on the situation. Meanwhile, those fleeing from the area ran to armoured vehicles that had brought them there and stated that the UN was clearly the target, as bullets were ricocheting off the vehicles as they drove away. At dawn on the fourth day, rebel troops were seen moving out across the runway. They had won. This major strategic base, Kigali Airport, was theirs. Prisoners and refugees were being lined up and searched. For the most part, they weren't soldiers but civilian militia, people alleged to have done so much damage. Hundreds of machetes were confiscated by rebels and the UN officers, the weapon of choice. A pitiful exodus followed from a country of slaughter. Over 1 million people inside Rwanda were on the move, the majority from the Hutu tribe, escaping the relentless advance of the rebel Tutsi army. As gunfire echoed across distant hills, panic set in amongst women and children, fearing revenge for the mass killings. These were the real faces of fear in Rwanda, Tutsi civilians who faced systematic slaughter. Trapped in a grim camp 30 miles from the capital Kigali, 20,000 refugees gathered. If they tried to leave, they knew that they would almost certainly be identified and killed by Hutu gangs, who served beatings on groups every night. While the UN investigated, Red Cross officials could only look on with horror at the butchery.
Anybody can walk into these camps and start to kill. And we just stand here and there's nothing we can do. And they do it. Everybody who wants to get into the camp with machete, with clubs, with machine guns, they kill, they move out and they move away. Nobody can do anything.
The Rwanda's government army, although present, seemed unable or unwilling to stop the killing. This was a country where almost the entire population was fleeing, had fled, or was dead.
We can just cope at the moment, but obviously our worst fear is that we get such a huge influx that, again, we would be swamped.
Thousands of Hutus fled to Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and mainly Zaire, hoping to escape Tutsi backlash. Yet most faced death from the squalor of refugee camps, rife with cholera and dysentery. UN agencies clash over reports RPF troops have carried out reprisal killings in Rwanda, and several hundred civilians are said to have been executed. Yet killing of Tutsis continued in the refugee camps. Outside the compound, the scale of the catastrophe was overwhelming. French soldiers believed there were up to 250,000 people in this encampment alone. Food deliveries were inadequate and increasingly a security risk.
We're just about to finish today's distribution of 90 tons of food. We give it out to the community leaders. They take it to the various camps and they divide it into the families then. Today was one of the calmest days we ever had.
Right. We want to go back home because many people are dying here. So of course we want to go home, but we can't go home without democracy because we can be killed by the army of RPF.
Some educated Hutus blamed the outside world for creating this disaster because an arms embargo meant they couldn't fight the Ugandan-backed RPF, so they had to flee.
If our army remain outside, how can Hutu people return home. It is not possible. They are afraid of the RPA, Rwanda's Patriotic Army.
On June 22, 1994, with no sign of UN deployment, the Security Council authorized the deployment of French forces to land in Goma, Zaire, on a humanitarian mission. They are deployed in southwest Rwanda. A safe area, coined Zone Turquoise, is created, yet killings of the Tutsis continue. Rwandan ambassador to France, Jacques Bihozagara, later testified Operation Turquoise was aimed only at protecting the genocide perpetrators, as genocide of the Tutsi continued within the so-called safe zone.
Whether the French will come here and provide some sort of protection for aid agencies is an open question at this point. Certainly, I don't think that should deter us from getting in food, medical supplies, trying to do something about the water and sanitation situation.
In New York on October 6, 1994, Rwandan President Pasteur Bizimungu addressed the 49th session of the United Nations General Assembly.
Il est plus qu'urgent de mettre sur pied ce tribunal international. Ce tribunal permettra de traduire en justice les responsables du génocide en toute transparence. Notre motivation est que nous voulons un instrument de justice sans frontières, étant donné que la plupart des criminels ont trouvé refuge dans plusieurs pays du monde.
It wasn't until January 1997 that the first case in the Rwandan genocide trials was heard before the International Crime Tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania. Jean-Paul Akuyusu is a local government official accused of ordering mass killings in his area. This was the first of many trials that exposed the atrocities that occurred during the 100 days of Rwandan genocide. It is a gruesome journey as evidence is delivered, detailing accounts of the bloodshed.
I'm here for, I believe my duty is to be here for the Rwandans who have suffered, but also in the memory of the UN soldiers who paid with their life to try to maintain the process of Arusha, that peace agreement, alive. I do hope that you will continue to pursue your interests in these past humanitarian catastrophes, and that in the future, hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children won't have to go through the horrific and terrible onslaught and martyrdom that the Rwandan people did have to live through.
10 years after the brutal massacre, world leaders and survivors of the genocide gathered in Kigali and observed 3 minutes of silence as part of many memorials being held worldwide. Rwandan President Paul Kagame, international dignitaries and Rwandan citizens packed a stadium to pay homage to the 800,000 victims of the slaughter. As choirs sang haunting songs, all were reminded of the senseless genocide of almost 1 million innocent people, with the slogans, "Never again," "Plus jamais." At a memorial conference marking the Rwandan anniversary, United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan acknowledged his role in the genocide.
The international community failed Rwanda and must always leave us with a sense of bitter regret and abiding sorrow. If the international community had acted promptly and with determination, it could have stopped most of the killing. But the political will was not there, nor were the troops. I myself, as head of UN Peacekeeping Department at the time, pressed dozens of countries for troops. I believed at that time that I was doing my best. But I realized after the genocide that there was more that I could and should have done to sound the alarm and rally support.
The Tokyo subway system transports millions of passengers daily and is one of the busiest commuter transport systems in the world. It's easy to see why a disaster, accident, or even the unthinkable, a deliberate attack, would be catastrophic. Tragically, the unthinkable did happen. The attack came at the peak of the Monday morning rush hour. At about 8 a.m. on March 20, 1995, a group of 5 teams from a Japanese Supreme Truth sect punctured packages of liquid sarin, a lethal nerve gas, in subway cars on multiple lines. Each dropped his package and pierced it several times with the sharpened tip of his umbrella, knowing that a single drop of sarin, the size of a pinhead, was all that was required to kill an adult.
It is extremely effective in very small amounts. It affects people by either breathing it in, or even penetration through the skin. So it's a very effective chemical warfare agent.
As the colourless, odourless agent developed by Nazis spread, confused commuters began coughing and gasping for breath, their eyes and noses running before fleeing, panic-stricken through station exits. Railway staff, rescue workers and police worked tirelessly to help rescue and save victims. It was an invisible terror few Tokyoites can forget. Since the horrific events in Tokyo, the September 11 attacks on the US, the London bombings, plus many other terrorist incidents, the global community is now, unfortunately, facing an increase in terrorist threats. Terrorism is everywhere and impacts all countries and all communities. This was no more evident than on the streets of New York in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. Citizens of New York, in the face of adversity, demonstrated extraordinary strength and courage to help one another. An equally devastating terror attack took place in Madrid, Spain. The events, as with Tokyo, targeted everyday train commuters. On the morning of March the 11th, 2004, as thousands of commuters made their way to work, 10 bombs packed with nails and dynamite exploded on 4 trains heading into central Madrid. The blasts killed 191 people and injured nearly 1,800.
Ahí justo está el tren y está partido por la mitad, o sea que hay 2 explosiones muy fuertes, ¿no? Han empezado a sacar heridos graves de aquí de este centro de salud, han salido médicos corriendo para ayudar y nada, y eso es todo. Ya ven ustedes cómo está todo lleno de ambulancias y además han acordonado la zona porque dicen que hay amenaza de bomba, no sabemos ya si hay más o no.
With 2,000 people injured, the emergency services were overwhelmed as they attempted to treat the wounded. As is normal when a catastrophe of this magnitude occurs, the people of Spain and the rest of the world gathered around their television sets for updates on the day's events. TV footage at the time shows ordinary citizens helping the paramedics. Passing buses turn into temporary ambulances, even hearses, transferring the wounded and the dead to the hospitals. Unlikely buildings become temporary morgues and chapels of rest. The investigation into the Madrid bombings lasted for 2 years, during which time more than 100 people were arrested. Recent events have made chemical and biological weapons even more desirable to terrorist groups. Now that the world has progressed, the likeliness of incident involving weapons of mass destruction is very real, particularly chemical weapons. Although considered difficult to obtain, the threat can't be ignored.
I think an attack with chemical or biological agents is less likely than resort to explosives, simply because acquiring sufficient quantities of chemicals or biological agents is going to be difficult, and disseminating them or spreading them is equally problematic.
They may appear as the poor man's atomic bomb, and for a very crude weapon, that's fair enough, but there really are so many contingencies that we see very little use of them.
The future holds many developments in store for the civilized world when it comes to terrorists and chemical weapons. The first two concern chemical weapons. These are the development of binary weapons and the further proliferation of chemical weapons to nations sympathetic to terrorists. The next group concerns the nature of terrorism. This includes a simple increase of terrorist activity, the crackdown by anti-terrorist forces on traditional methods, and the decrease in the reluctance of a terrorist group to use chemical weapons due to the successful incident in Tokyo. Across America and the UK, army surplus stores are experiencing an ever-growing increase in trade as many people are choosing to deal with their fears through the purchase of equipment which will protect them.
We usually sell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 a year. We've sold, I would think, to present date, what we're sending down to London and around the country, 100 in less than a week. The demand is absolutely horrendous.
With items such as gas masks and chemical protection suits on the rise, the public's perception of further threats of this nature sadly seem very real and very deadly. It was another calm early morning on the subway train. Many of the passengers were napping on their way to work. The train slowed to a stop to allow more passengers on, then sped along to its destination, the central government district in Tokyo. Many of the passengers found it strange that a man who got on at the last stop was wearing sunglasses, but soon dismissed it, remembering how safe the subways and their homeland had always been. Well, they were mistaken. The man with the glasses got off the train before it reached its destination.
One man was seen putting one of the devices down at about 8:15 in the morning and getting off the train and leaving it behind, and the thing started emitting gas. But the man was heavily disguised. I mean, he was wearing dark glasses. He had a sort of gauze mask over his mouth.
By the time anyone became suspicious, many people on the train were coughing. Those near enough to see the package and the clear liquid seeping from it began feeling dizzy, and many were bleeding from the nose and mouth.
今度頭が痛くなってきて、でやっぱりこう息苦しいのが続いたので。
もう仕事ですよね。当然そんな毒ガスだって自分は思ってませんし、ただなんでもう目がこうなんていうんですかね、見えなくなってるんじゃないんですけど、しょぼしょぼしてきたのも分かったし自分で。で当日明け晩だったんで。疲れてるのかなぐらいしか思ってなかったんですよ。で結局はそのカウンターの中で倒れちゃうんですけども、
This was not the only train car to receive such a dangerous package. This and 4 similar incidents took place at about the same time in the Tokyo subway system on March 20, 1995. 2 of the subway lines targeted ran through the heart of Tokyo. Tubes of the gas on the train spread through the carriages, killing those within a few feet. It was so deadly it even affected those standing on platforms where the trains had stopped. The 5 packages were disguised to look like lunchboxes or soda containers, and it was reported that the chemical agent used was an impure or dilute solution of sarin, a nerve agent developed by Nazi Germany during the 30s. This was the beginning of a frightening future for the modern world. Organised and indiscriminate murder on a large scale is clearly possible, and chemical weapons are likely to be a terrorist's vehicle for mass destruction.
The chemistry involved and the acquisition of the raw materials is probably not that tough for an organization that has resources. And one of the things which I'm afraid we've learned over the last couple of decades is that terrorist organizations do have resources.
A 2008 law enacted by the Japanese government authorised payments of damages to victims of the gas attack because the attack was directed at the government of Japan. As of December 2009, 5,259 people had applied for benefits under the law. Recent surveys of the victims show that many are still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Shinri Kyo, the group behind the attacks and currently known as Aleph, is a Japanese religious movement. The group was founded by Shoko Asahara in 1984. At the time of the attacks, the group claimed they had 9,000 members in Japan and as many as 40,000 worldwide. The name Shinri Kyo derives from the Sanskrit syllable which represents the universe, followed by Shinrai Kyo, written in kanji, roughly meaning religion of truth. In English, the name translates to supreme truth. The cult started attracting controversy in the late 1980s, with accusations of extortion, deception of recruits, and of holding cult members against their will and forcing members to donate money. A murder of a cult member who tried to leave is now known to have taken place in February 1989. At the end of 1993, the cult started secretly manufacturing the nerve agent sarin and later VX gas. A bizarre and startling discovery in the arid outback of Western Australia presented a dramatic twist to the Tokyo subway gas attack. Sheep carcasses were found at a remote property owned previously by the where they had tested sarin, killing 29 sheep.
Obviously there'll be speculation that the deaths of the sheep were part of some testing program before the use of the sarin gas in that attack, but as Minister for Justice, plainly I'm not prepared to speculate on those links. What I can say is that we have made all the information we have now available to the Japanese police.
Both sarin and VX were then used in several assassinations and attempts over 1994 to 1995. Most notably, on the night of the 27th of June 1994, the cult carried out the world's first use of chemical weapons in a terrorist attack against civilians, when they released sarin in the central Japanese city of Matsumoto, Nagano. The Matsumoto incident killed 8 and harmed 200 more. Police investigations focused only on an innocent local resident and failed to implicate the cult at the time. On the day of the Tokyo attacks, ambulances transported 688 patients and nearly 5,000 people reached hospitals by other means. Hospitals saw 5,510 patients, 17 of whom were deemed critical, 37 severe, and 984 moderately ill with vision problems. Most of those reporting to hospitals were referred to as the worried well, which had to be distinguished from those that were ill. By mid-afternoon, the mildly affected victims had recovered from vision problems and were released from hospital. Most of the remaining patients were well enough to go home the following day, and within a week, only a few critical patients remained in hospital. The death toll on the day of the attack was 8. Fortunately, the numbers were not higher, bearing in mind exposure to a very small dose can be fatal.
One drop of sarin on the skin will result in the death of healthy adult.
Emergency services, including police, fire and ambulance, were criticised for their handling of the attack and the injured. As were the media, some of whom, though present at subway entrances filming, hesitated when asked to transport victims to the hospital. The subway authority was also criticised for its failure to halt several of the trains despite reports of passenger injury. So too was the health services, including hospitals and health staff. One hospital refused to admit a victim for almost an hour, and many hospitals turned victims away. Sarin poisoning was not well known at the time, and many hospitals were overwhelmed. They only received information on diagnosis and treatment because a professor at Shinshu University happened to see reports on television. Added to this was a severe shortage of sarin's antidotes in Tokyo. Collection of the antidote came from rural hospitals with stores held for herbicide-insecticide poisoning. Dr. Nobu Yanagisawa had experience with treating sarin poisoning after the Matsumoto incident. He recognised the symptoms, had information on diagnosis and treatment collected, and led a team who sent the information to hospitals throughout Tokyo via fax. St. Luke's Hospital at Sige was one of the very few hospitals in Tokyo at that time to have the entire building wired and piped for conversion into a field hospital in the event of a major disaster. This proved to be a very fortunate coincidence as the hospital was able to take in most of the 600 plus victims from the Sige station, resulting in no fatalities. The sarin attack was the most serious terrorist attack in Japan's modern history. It caused massive disruption and widespread fear in a society that had previously been perceived as virtually free of crime. Shortly after the attack, lost its status as a religious organisation, and many of its assets were seized. However, the Diet, Japanese parliament, rejected a request from government officials to outlaw the group. In 1999, the Diet gave the Commission broad powers to monitor and curtail the activities of groups that had been involved in indiscriminate mass murder and whose leaders are holding strong sway over their members. A bill custom-tailored to Shinrikayo.
今日で10年になりますけれども、年月の速さはもう感じております。でも、駅構内の中でも被疑者と言われるポスターが貼られておりますし、諸外国も含めてテロ事件というのが発生しているのを聞きますと、やっぱり不安であるというふうには思っておりますけど。
Prosecutors allege that Asahara was tipped off about planned police raids on cult facilities by an insider and ordered an attack in central Tokyo to divert attention away from the group. The plan evidently backfired, and the police conducted huge simultaneous raids on cult compounds across the country. Over the next week, the full scale of activities was revealed for the first time. At the cult's headquarters at the foot of Mount Fuji, police found explosives, chemical weapons, and biological warfare agents such as anthrax and Ebola cultures, and a Russian military helicopter. There were stockpiles of chemicals that could be used for producing enough sarin to kill 4 million people. Police also found laboratories to manufacture drugs such as LSD, methamphetamine, and a crude form of truth serum, a safe containing millions of dollars in cash and gold, and cells, many still containing prisoners. During the raids, issued statements claiming that the chemicals that were found were for fertilizers. Over the next 6 weeks, over 150 cult members were arrested for a variety of offences. The media was stationed outside their Tokyo headquarters for months after the attack and arrests, waiting for action and to get images of the cult's other members. Shoko Asahara, founder of the group, was finally found hiding within a wall of a cult building on 16th of May and was arrested. On the same day, the cult mailed a parcel bomb to the office of the governor of Tokyo, blowing the fingers off his secretary's hands.
By the logic of the law, if Asahara is found guilty of the murders he's accused of, he should get a death penalty. But I think it would be a very brave Minister of Justice, a very brave Japanese administration who would actually put him to death. I think he still has that residual holy aura which would make an administration here very reluctant to do that.
The trial, dubbed the trial of the century by the press, ruled Asahara guilty of masterminding the attack and sentenced him to death.
まあね、死刑が最高の刑であれば仕方ないのかなとは思いますけれども、ね、納得いかない人は納得いかないでしょうね。家族の方とか、もう本当にたくさんの方が忘れられないことですからね。
The indictment was appealed unsuccessfully. A number of senior members accused of participation also received death sentences.
長かったなと思って7年10ヶ月がもっと短く出れば家族の人とかも良かったんじゃないかなと思ってまあ死刑は当然だと思いました。
The reasons why a small circle of mostly senior members committed atrocities and the extent of personal involvement by Asahara remain unclear to this day, although several theories have attempted to explain these events. Shortly after his arrest, Asahara abandoned the post of organisation leader and since then has maintained silence, refusing to communicate even with lawyers and family members. Many believe the trials failed to establish truth behind the events. Today, the group continues to recruit new members under the new name Aleph. Though the group has renounced its violent past, it still continues to follow Asahara's spiritual teachings. Members operate several businesses, though boycotts of known Aleph-related businesses, in addition to searches, confiscations of possible evidence, and picketing by protest groups have resulted in closures. Aleph remains on the US State Department's list of terrorist groups, but has not been linked to any further terrorist acts or any terrorist acts in the US. Aleph has announced a change of its policies, apologised to victims of the subway attack, and established a special compensation fund. The tragic incident on March 20, 1995, resulting in the senseless killing of innocent people, continues to reverberate for the victims and their families. For the rest of us, it serves to remind us that the ripple effect of terrorism is everywhere we are, and it affects all of us in every country and every community. 1945, World War II. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, are destroyed by the first atomic bombs used in warfare. US President Truman said at the time, "The atomic bomb heralds the harnessing of the basic power of the universe and marks a victory over the Germans in the race to be the first to develop a weapon using atomic energy." On August 6, 1945, in the early morning hours, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian and headed toward Japan. The bomber's primary target was the city of Hiroshima, which at the time was of considerable military significance, with a civilian population of approximately 300,000. This atomic bomb, with a blast equivalent to 12,000 tons of TNT, flattened the city, killing 100,000 civilians outright and many more over time. The results were terrifying. A third of the city was obliterated, the rest lay in ruins. Those closest to the explosion died instantly, their bodies turned to black char. The bomb killed men, women and children indiscriminately. While Japan was still trying to comprehend this devastation 3 days later, the United States struck again, this time on Nagasaki. The Japanese government sued for peace on the following day, and on August 14, 1945, Japan accepted the Allied terms of unconditional surrender. The Second World War was over. From this devastation, it would be reborn to challenge humanity to a higher destiny. The city engaged in the arduous task of rebuilding, but Hiroshima could never again be just a city. Scarred forever, it became something deeper, rooted in the human psyche, a symbol of devastation and potential extinction, but also a symbol of hope and rebirth.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the site of two of America's three great factories producing the atomic bomb. For over 2 years, this secret city had been laboring on the weapon that has changed the world.
6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the US government decided that if anyone could figure out how to build an atomic bomb, they had to do it first. They knew the Germans already had a head start. From 1942 until 1949, Oak Ridge, a city of 78,000 people, did not exist on any map.
Within its barriers, a population of 78,000 lived and worked under conditions of incredible secrecy. Shopping centers and newspapers served the needs of the Oak Ridge community.
The city operated 24 hours a day. The plants operated day and night. 840 buses brought people to work here and took them home.
Leading scientists of Britain and America worked as a team according to the plan agreed on long before by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. The whole vast operation was hidden under the code name Manhattan Project.
Simply put, the Manhattan Project was committed to expediting research that would produce a viable atomic bomb. The project resulted in the creation of several research and production sites, of which the construction and operations were secret. It began as a small research program in 1939, which eventually employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion US. The formulas for refining uranium and putting together a working atomic bomb were created and seen to their logical ends by some of the greatest minds of our time. Chief among the people who unleashed the power of the atom was Robert Oppenheimer, who oversaw the project from conception to completion. The most complicated issue to be addressed in making of an atomic bomb was the production of ample amounts of enriched uranium to sustain a chain reaction.
Here is the terrific fact of atomic energy. One atom weapon has the explosive power of 2,011-ton bombs.
Finally, the day came when all at Los Alamos would find out if the gadget, codenamed as such during its development, was going to be an enormous failure or perhaps an end to the war. On July 16, 1945, in a white blaze, the gadget ushered in the atomic age. World War II in Asia and the Pacific was fought over the largest area of any conflict in history. Japanese submarines bombarded the Californian coast, and their aircraft carriers raided harbours and sank British shipping off the coast of India. The expanse of land and sea which lay between these places encompasses half of the planet. a testament to the determination of both sides of the conflict. As millions of people celebrated victory in Europe Day, the Allied leaders grimly prepared for the final struggle in the Pacific, where the full weight of the Allied forces would now be applied against Japan. Over the long expanse of Pacific waters between Asia, Australia and North America, the islands which came to fame during the war have slowly drifted out of public consciousness. Places with odd names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa and Siam were the centre of the universe for a world at war, and everyone talked of the latest news there. The war culminated in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and other large aerial bombing attacks by the United States Army Air Forces, accompanied by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on 8th of August 1945. The 15th of August 1945 saw the surrender of Japan and the end of fighting during World War II. The formal and official surrender of Japan occurred aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945. In May 1945, the Target Committee at Los Alamos, led by Robert Oppenheimer, recommended Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama and the arsenal at Kokura as possible targets for the drop of the atomic bomb. These cities were largely untouched during the nightly bombing raids, and the Army Air Force agreed to leave them off the target list, so accurate assessment of the weapon could be made. The Target Committee stated that it was agreed that psychological factors in the target selection were of great importance. Two aspects of this are: 1, obtaining the greatest psychological effect against Japan, and 2, making the initial use sufficiently spectacular for the importance of the weapon to be internationally recognized when publicity on it is released. Kyoto had a considered advantage of being an important center for military industry, as well as an intellectual center, and hence better able to appreciate the significance of the weapon. Hiroshima was described as an important army depot and port of embarkation in the middle of an urban industrial area. It also met the criteria in that it was considered a good radar target, was such a size that a large part of the city could be extensively damaged, and adjacent hills were likely to produce a focusing effect which would considerably increase the blast damage. So from this assessment, the strategic decision was made. Hiroshima was to become the primary target of the first nuclear bombing mission, with Kokura and Nagasaki being alternative targets. The 393rd Bombardment Squadron B-29 Enola Gay, piloted and commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, was launched from Northfield Air Base on Tinian in the West Pacific, about 6 hours flight time from Japan. The Enola Gay, named after Colonel Tibbets' mother, was accompanied by 2 other B-29s. After leaving Tinian, the aircraft made their way separately to Iwo Jima, where they rendezvoused and set course for Japan. The aircraft arrived over the target in clear visibility. During the journey, Navy Captain William Parsons had armed the bomb, which had been left unarmed to minimise the risks during takeoff. Second Lieutenant Morris Jepson removed the safety devices 30 minutes before reaching the target area. The Tokyo control operator of the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation noticed that the Hiroshima station had gone off the air. He tried to re-establish his program by using another telephone line, but it too had failed. About 20 minutes later, the Tokyo Railroad Telegraph Center realized that the mainline telegraph had stopped working just north of the city. From some small railway stops within 16 kilometres came the unofficial and confused reports of a terrible explosion in Hiroshima.
When it was all over, 4.5 square miles of Hiroshima was burned and blasted to extinction. The all-shattering devastation in which was born the atomic age. In its birth pangs, 75,000 people were killed, 70,000 injured.
A young officer of the Japanese General Staff was instructed to fly immediately to Hiroshima to land, survey the damage, and return to Tokyo with reliable information for the staff. The staff officer, after flying for about 3 hours, while still nearly 100 miles from Hiroshima, saw a great cloud of smoke from the bomb. In the bright afternoon, the remains of Hiroshima were burning. Their plane soon reached the city, around which they circled in disbelief.
A few miles away was the notorious prisoner of war camp at Ofuna. From this place of foulness and ill treatment, freedom has come at last to another batch of happy soldiers to whom Japanese guards bow as they leave for home.
By August 8, 1945, newspapers in the US were reporting that broadcasts from Radio Tokyo had described the destruction observed in Hiroshima. Practically all living things, human and animal, were literally seared to death. Japanese radio announcers said in a broadcast received by Allied sources. According to the US Department of Energy, the immediate effects of the blast killed approximately 70,000 people in Hiroshima and 40,000 in Nagasaki. Some estimates state up to 200,000 had died by 1950 due to cancer and other long-term effects.
This was Hiroshima after that fateful August of 1945. Today, nearly 5 years after the dropping of the first atomic bomb, the city is almost completely rebuilt, but still yields invaluable scientific data on the effects of an atom blast. In this laboratory and clinic, American and Japanese scientists are conducting vital research to determine the long-range effect of radiation on human beings. Bomb survivors are kept under continuous observation, but the nature of the work also makes it essential to study children born in the city since the blast. Meanwhile, American aid takes care of the many orphans of the atom bomb, children now recovering from the horrifying dawn of the atomic age.
Starting in 1951, the Nevada test site became the primary location for all US nuclear testing. Tests were divided into two primary categories, weapons-related and weapons effects. In the beginning, almost all nuclear tests were either atmospheric or underwater. Testing was used as a sign of both national and technological strength, but also raised questions about the safety of the tests, which released nuclear fallout into the atmosphere. Hundreds of these tests were conducted at the Nevada test site in the USA. Because testing was seen as a sign of technological development, halts on testing were often called for as stand-ins for halts in the nuclear arms race itself. And many prominent scientists and statesmen lobbied for a ban on nuclear testing.
In these first official films of American troops' atomic training, we see tabs placed on rifles and other equipment in order to measure the amount of radiation from an atom bomb explosion like this.
In 1958, the US, the USSR, and the United Kingdom declared a temporary testing moratorium for both political and health reasons. But by 1961, the Soviet Union had broken the moratorium, and both the USSR and the US began testing with great frequency.
And now comes news that America has staged a combined military and civil defense test in which dummies, cars of recent make, and two types of average house were used as guinea pigs. The test proved that an invading army could be destroyed at close range, and troops took cover only 2 miles from the blast center, the nearest humans to an atom blast since Nagasaki. The troops moved forward to occupy the atomized objective. With them went detector squads using Geiger counters. They found one house and a tank too radioactive to enter. So science perfects the weapons of the future, weapons that we all hope will never have to be used.
The 7th HMS Dreadnought was the United Kingdom's first nuclear-powered submarine, launched by Queen Elizabeth II on Trafalgar Day 1960.
I name this ship Dreadnought. May God bless her and all who serve in her.
A S-3W reactor, a design made available as a direct result of the 1958 US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement, powered the submarine. The Polaris missile was built during the Cold War by Lockheed Corporation of California for the United States Navy. It was designed to be used as part of the Navy's contribution to the United States arsenal of nuclear weapons, replacing the Regulus cruise missile. The anti-nuclear movement is a social movement that opposes the use of nuclear technologies. Since the dawn of the atomic age, protests and demonstrations have occurred worldwide, giving a voice to the people. Many direct action groups, environmental groups, and professional organizations have identified themselves with the movement at local, national, and international level. The initial objective of the movement was nuclear disarmament, though the focus has shifted primarily to opposition to the use of nuclear power.
Well, look, the case is quite simple. We think that the policy which is being pursued by the Western powers is one which is almost bound to end in the extermination of the human race. And some of us think that that might be rather a pity.
Ozyorsk is a closed town in Chelyabinsk Oblast, Russia. The city, as the people called it, was and remains a closed town because of its proximity to the Mayak plant, one of the sources of Soviet plutonium during the Cold War. The Mayak plant was built in 1945 in a great hurry and in total secrecy as part of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapon program. German prisoners of war designed some of the best buildings there, with much of the labour provided by political prisoners of the time. The plant's original mission was to make, refine and machine plutonium for weapons. The Soviets' first and biggest bomb factory, the arms race started here. These people made the Soviet Union a superpower. On the iron gates, the number 235 appeared. Uranium-235 was the stuff of atomic bombs. 5 nuclear reactors were built for this purpose. Later, the plant came to specialize in reprocessing plutonium from decommissioned weapons and waste from nuclear reactors. Working conditions at Mayak resulted in severe health hazards and many accidents. The most notable accident occurred on the 29th of September 1957. Hundreds of people died, thousands were injured, and surrounding areas were evacuated. This nuclear accident, the Soviet Union's worst before the Chernobyl disaster, became a post-nuclear hell. Hundreds of square miles were left barren and unusable for decades, and maybe centuries. July 31, 1991. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty is signed between the United States of America and the USSR on the reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. START negotiated the largest and most complex arms control treaty in history, and its final implementation in late 2001 resulted in the removal of about 80% of all strategic nuclear weapons then in existence. Today, close to 97% of all nuclear weapons are found in the United States and Russia. From the depths of despair and tragedy, we are often inspired and touched at a very deep level by the stories of survival, courage and conviction. Sadako Sasaki was a Japanese girl who was 2 years old when the atomic bomb was dropped near her home. By November 1954, Chickenpox had developed on her neck and behind her ears. A year later, purple spots had started to form on her legs. Sadako was diagnosed with leukemia, hospitalized and given at the most a year to live. Sadako's best friend, Shizuko Hamamoto, came to the hospital to visit and cut a golden piece of paper into a square and folded it into a paper crane. At first, Sadako didn't understand why Shizuko was doing this, but then Shizuko retold the story about the paper cranes. That one who folded 1,000 cranes was granted a wish. Inspired by the cranes, Sadako started folding them herself. Sadly, so the story goes, she fell short of her goal of folding 1,000 cranes, having folded only 644 before her death. Her friends completed the 1,000 and buried them all with her. The retelling of Sadako's story and others like it is so vital for future generations to learn from the past atrocities, to ensure human life is preserved and human rights are protected.
In the People's Republic of China in 1989, hundreds of thousands of civilians took to the streets, protesting for freedom.
The choices is either staging a battle that might involve the risk of your life, or alternative of a permanent slavery. So in 1989, I guess some of us, I think our generation collectively decided it's time to stage a fight.
A fight is exactly what the people got. After weeks of mainly peaceful protest, the government decided it was enough. Vast numbers of soldiers and tanks were sent to Beijing to break up the pro-democracy protest. Tiananmen Square was packed with a huge crowd, keeping a quiet vigil for freedom. The troops easily broke through barricades, crushing civilians with their tanks and firing shots randomly into the crowd, restoring a hold on the people with an iron grip. In what became known as the Tiananmen Square massacre, thousands are believed to have been killed and wounded. Shocked and subdued, the protesters had lost their chance for freedom, and the brief battle was over. Throughout the country, people mourned the many who had died and the many more who were imprisoned or executed in the wake of the abortive bid for democracy. In the years since, China's people have enjoyed a surging economy, improved quality of living, and an apparent openness, but control is never far away. China's people may enjoy personal freedoms to study, travel, earn, and spend, but political freedom is another thing, and the boundaries are firmly set. True freedom of speech remains out of reach. Pushed too far, and the Chinese people could once again face the true cost. During almost 30 years of Mao Zedong's leadership, mainland China underwent a tumultuous period. At least 50 million people were executed. A disastrous attempt to rationalize the rural sector resulted in wide-scale famine, and the industrialization of the nation met with major initial failings. In 1978, the reformist Deng Xiaoping became paramount leader, and China's fledgling new industries took flight. The nation gradually opened itself out to the world markets, providing a foundation for probably the most outstanding development of an economy the world has ever seen. By the late 1980s, China had turned full circle, becoming a much freer market economy, mostly driven by supply and demand instead of government-set pricing. The private sector was encouraged, foreign trade restrictions were relaxed, and the government even welcomed joint ventures with foreign entities as a means of improving the trade balance and gaining access to technology. The flow-on to the populace meant rising standards of living, so that a nation of predominantly poor evolved into a nation of consumers, with middle-class aspirations and a newfound awareness of the outside world. Mainland China had undergone a massive economic and cultural shift in a very short time, sowing the seeds of political change.
Economic prosperity will suggest more equal opportunity, a more open information flow, a more equal judicial system. Well, it not only suggests, it calls for it, it applies pressure to the leaders on the top, from within and outside of China. And when these forces are strong enough, democracy will take place in China.
As China opened its doors to the outside world, its citizens saw a rapidly changing political landscape, with a wave of democratic change beginning its sweep through Eastern Europe. China's intellectuals and students renewed their earlier demands for greater democratic rights. They called for an end to the entrenched corruption within the various layers of the political system, a desire widely shared in China. Then, as now, Chinese economic growth was unequal, and for many workers, conditions had worsened, exacerbated by rampant inflation and official corruption. Millions of young rural workers had flooded the cities, living in poor conditions and with few rights. The rising discontent of vast numbers of workers, along with students and intellectuals agitating for political change, presented the government with a serious problem. It was the students who started the protest movement.
Great feeling about interconnectedness among people. I think it happens in any mass movement. We feel this great love is in the air. I mean, everybody felt so good about themselves, and they relate to each other in a very warm, open way. When the massacre happened, the mass despair, and all of a sudden, this short-lived, beautiful dream was gone, and what's left of that is blood on the street and bullet holes in your window.
The protests were sparked by the death of Hu Yaobang, a reformist anti-corruption party leader who had been forced to resign for advocating freedom of speech and the media, as well as a softer line on Tibet. He had supported student ideals, and now they honored his memory, protesting the government's unfair treatment of him. Students took to the streets in protest, 100,000 gathering in Tiananmen Square to mourn Hu as a victim of an authoritarian government mired in corruption. The student protest grew, amassing wider support from the workers and even the ordinary people who felt disenfranchised and overlooked by a leadership of inflexible old men. When 1 million people marched in protest on the 27th of April, it was evident that even members of the army identified with the movement, and the government began to fear civil war. No longer just a student protest, this had become a people's movement, reminiscent of the 1949 People's Revolution, and the government would not under any circumstances tolerate another revolution. If anyone had believed the protesters were just a few selfish troublemakers, as the government-controlled media had claimed, that changed when thousands of students participated in a series of lengthy hunger strikes in Tiananmen Square. The students' fasts were viewed as risky and brave acts of defiance, selfless deeds on behalf of the nation as a whole, and drew much support from the public. The students of several universities also boycotted their classes, often with full support of their lecturers, who were sympathetic to the protests and also participated. As the protests continued over several weeks, study increasingly took a back seat to events at Tiananmen Square. Much to the consternation of the government, the protests sparked demonstrators in other mainland cities and even spread to Hong Kong and Taiwan. By now, the demonstrations were the largest display of anti-government sentiment since 1949, and police were unable to hold back the defiant masses. On May 20th, the government declared martial law. The troops initially sent in faced strong resistance and were unable to take control. Many of them were young with little experience and quite bewildered, while several of the older troops sympathized with the students, some even with family members in the protests. Unable to reach the square or withdraw, troops were stuck for 3 days, during which time residents gave them food and drink and told them why they shouldn't be there. Their replacements were more hardline. They were brought in specifically to complete the job. They came from areas far away with no connections to Beijing or its people and no sympathy for the protesters. Deng Xiaoping and other party elders made the decision to use military force against the people in order to clear the square and end the counter-revolutionary activity, as they described it. The government was suffering a terrible loss of face at home and internationally, where the protests were receiving widespread media coverage. The crackdown had to be swift and decisive. On the night of June 3rd, around 200,000 soldiers entered Beijing with orders to shoot the civilians. The tanks went first, riding straight over people and crushing them. The soldiers followed, shooting into the crowds and slaying people with their bayonets. In the streets miles away from Tiananmen Square, wild bullet spray hit bystanders and passed through windows, killing people in their apartments. The People's Army was slaughtering the people. An estimated 2 million people slowed their approach with barricades, jamming the tanks' tracks with iron bars and attacking with Molotov cocktails and rocks. They set fire to vehicles and tanks, sometimes burning the occupants alive and dragging soldiers from their tanks and trucks and beating them to death. But the army relentlessly advanced towards Tiananmen Square, where the core of students, intellectuals, and workers had a decision to make: resist and face almost certain death, or accept defeat. At 5 a.m. on the 4th, they gave up the now unwinnable fight and left unharmed. Despite its name, the massacre was not actually in the square, but on the surrounding streets where the mayhem continued. Courageous rickshaw drivers braved the danger zone, dashing in to rescue seriously injured people and ferrying them to hospitals. Medical staff were overwhelmed with the huge numbers of gunshot wounds, and doctors' faces were smeared with blood, attempting often futile mouth-to-mouth resuscitations. By 6 a.m., Tiananmen Square itself was empty, the army meeting the deadline the government had set. Later in the morning, a group of parents of missing students attempted to re-enter the square, but were shot by soldiers, with dozens killed. Throughout the morning, as people approached the square or tried to remove the wounded, they were immediately set upon, shot in the back as they fled. In the face of this, the world witnessed an extraordinary sight. Single-handed Tank Man, as he became known, stopped a column of tanks in an act of daring defiance. He even spoke with the soldiers inside, reportedly asking, "Why are you here? You have caused nothing but misery." In his own way, Tank Man defeated the army, soon disappearing into the crowd unharmed. The images of his defiance inspired people around the world, reminding them of the power of the human spirit in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Over the following weeks, several arrests were made, with workers receiving far harsher sentences. Several were executed, and others served long prison terms. While some students were jailed, they received relatively light sentences, and others were merely blacklisted. Many ultimately managed to escape, establishing new lives in other countries. Leading into the Tiananmen Square protests, China had been slowly but surely edging towards some degree of liberalization. Not necessarily democracy, but at least a relaxing of some of the old restrictions. In a period of relatively stable international relations, the focus had been less on military expansion and more on boosting production and foreign trade. All that, of course, changed in 1989 as the government cracked down hard, introducing tight controls in a determined bid to make sure the people remained in check. The government injected more funds into the People's Liberation Army and expanded its military training. 1 year of compulsory training was brought in for university students, a move designed not just to bolster training troops, but as a means of instilling discipline and obedience.
所以我们一直就是从80年代末就开始有这样的一个项目，这样可以培养学生的集体荣誉感，还有团结精神，还有一些就是纪律，尤其是纪律对北大学生是意义很重大的。
The People's Liberation Army is the world's largest, with a mixture of regular and reserve members totaling 3 million. Although military service is compulsory for all males over 18, the government has never had to enforce this, as plenty of young men volunteer for service. Women can enlist for medical, veterinary, and technical services from as young as 14, and even primary school children are given an introductory boot camp. In 2007, a record 50 million children between 9 and 18 spent 4 weeks in military training. With lessons learned from Tiananmen Square, the Chinese troops are now equipped with soft weapons, such as rubber bullets for maintaining order, a move that would have meant a far better outcome all around in 1989.
Government killing its own people is the worst kind of terrorism. It can go down in history only as a crime against humanity.
Many foreign journalists were already in China for Mikhail Gorbachev's visit, and so Tiananmen Square played out on television screens and in newspapers around the world. China's softer image was shattered by pictures of starving students and tanks rolling in and crushing the people.
They want people to forget. They want people to just simply let it go. But the justice needs to be done.
More than 20 years on, the Tiananmen Square massacre is a taboo subject. Family members visiting the graves of slain protesters are discouraged, and media presence is particularly unwelcome. On each anniversary, a large rally in Hong Kong's Victoria Park remembers the victims, with a demand that the Communist Party's heavily doctored official version of events be changed to reflect the truth. In other mainland cities, people hold emotional candlelit vigils, but this is not allowed in Beijing itself. Unlike other historic Chinese events, June 4th, 1989 is not a date you'll find in Chinese history books and is most certainly not taught at school. Mainstream book publications studiously ignore it, even serious historical texts. The media is instructed not to mention it, and this policy is rigidly enforced. Internet censorship blocks this topic, although some people do occasionally get around the censor's filters with tricks like referring to the date as May 35th.
Does the date June the 4th mean anything to you?
June the 4th. Is that the national day for the USA? No. For France?
It's a very important date for China.
June the
4th.
Oh.
June the 4th. Okay, I see. That's a bit. I mean, the day you mean several years ago.
As time passes and a generation goes through school shielded from this event, the Chinese government is successfully erasing a chapter of China's history.
I don't think the dream has really died. It was crushed by the tank and machine guns. And the last 12 years, China has gone into another direction. There's money, there's economic reform, but the political freedom has not been given to the Chinese people. I just think what happened 12 years ago is not completely over yet.
In 1989, China's people came tantalizingly close to a degree of democratic change. Some key figures within the party felt that it was time for political reform, but ultimately the old guard held sway. Conservatives like Premier Li Peng opposed a more relaxed economic and political landscape. Li allegedly portrayed the students as counter-revolutionaries to paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, persuading him to evoke martial law, and Li himself signed the order. Li's style contrasted sharply with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced reforms in the spirit of glasnost, or openness, leading to the democratic changes that spread through the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The students hoped for similar change in China, but faced entrenched opposition.
They are repeatedly declaring that the massacre was necessary, righteous, and even divine.
Following Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, China has developed into a world powerhouse. Its rapid economic growth has resulted in a huge boost to living standards, with the number of poor dropping drastically in the last 2 decades. China is now positioned as a global superpower, and with the 2008 Beijing Olympics, grabbed the opportunity to present itself to the world as a sophisticated and successful nation. It still weathers ongoing controversy over Tibet, an exploited workforce, and the deep seams of government corruption that continue to keep many people poor and a few people very rich. Despite this, the government is enormously popular with the people, who have a nationalist fervor that borders on the extreme. An increasing number of individuals, however, continue to be frustrated by the lack of basic freedoms, its poor human rights record, and the extremely high rate of executions.
There is certainly no indication of the Chinese leadership engaging in democratic reforms yet. But in the eyes of many intellectuals in China, this issue cannot be avoided, at least cannot be avoided in the intermediate term. Perhaps the present situation may go on for 5-6 years, but probably no more.
More than 1.3 billion people currently live in China. If just one man can stop an army, anything's possible.
Montserrat, the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean, is located just near Antigua, a tropical paradise where tourists go to unwind and bask in the Caribbean sun, which gently embraces this tiny island. Montserrat is where two worlds meet. Lush, verdant vegetation against nature's majestic charge of black earth and steam, as the island is home to the only live volcano in the Caribbean. The good life along the shores of the Caribbean Sea came to an end on July 18, 1995. On that fateful day, Soufriere Hills volcano, which had lain dormant throughout recorded history, exploded in an eruption of titanic proportions and rendered the southern half of Montserrat uninhabitable. Two years later, in 1997, 19 people died after being overtaken by a pyroclastic flow following another eruption. The eruption eventually buried the island's capital, Plymouth, and forced over half of Montserrat's population to flee abroad. June 25, 1997, and a major collapse lasting about 20 minutes releases a massive amount of material. Pyroclastic flows reach to within 50 meters of the island's Bramble Airport, and ash cloud surges sweep over Farrell's Plain. By this time, more than half of Montserrat's inhabitants had been moved away after their homes and businesses were destroyed.
Basically, why a lot of people are really frustrated and want to go home is that when we moved, we didn't move in the intention of being here. Start this long, we'd move with the intention that we'd be around for 2 days, you know, and then we were going back home on the 3rd or 4th day.
In August 1997, a further series of eruptions destroyed approximately 80% of the city, burying it under 1.4 meters of ash. The city was abandoned, and the southern half of the island was declared an exclusion area due to the continued activity of Soufriere Hills. Plymouth now lies buried under layers of volcanic debris. Each time it rains in the Emerald Isle, a little more of the former capital disappears forever. Montserrat is only 16 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, and is built mostly exclusively of volcanic rocks. Less than 2 decades ago, the Georgian-era capital of Plymouth was a pleasant place to live. A little British outpost, complete with traditional red telephone boxes and a far more agreeable climate than the homeland. This island paradise, with its warm, friendly people, white sandy beaches, comprises 3 volcanic centres or massives of differing age. Scientists consider the active volcano one of the most interesting wonders in the world. On July 18, 1995, ash and steam venting was first observed. Activity was largely confined to the northwest flank of Castle Peak Lava Dome, which was formed in the 17th century in English Crater. Largely phreatic activity continued, reaching a first climax in a large phreatic explosion on August 21, 1995. which threw ash over much of Plymouth and initiated a first evacuation. It was immediately clear that the city was in danger on that day. Tephra, the solid material ejected by a volcano, fell on Plymouth, and in December residents were evacuated as a precaution. Plymouth was again evacuated in August 1997, when a further series of eruptions destroyed approximately 80% of the city, burying it under 1.4 metres of ash. This burned many of the buildings, therefore making inhabitation nearly impossible for a sizable portion of the residents. It was the thick blanket of ash that covered everything inches deep, a film that grimed every surface, and powder that crept through every crack. The tiny British colony was on its 6th day of massive disruption after warnings to evacuate the island as the volatile Chances Peak volcano threatened to explode following a series of minor earthquakes. Half the island had been displaced, with no idea when the people would be allowed home. 2 Royal Marines were dispatched to record the activities of the volcano, as visibility was too poor for a helicopter to do the job.
Anywhere along here. Come from the top now.
Corporal Jim Oakley and a colleague climbed to within 250 metres of the volcano and were caught unawares when the crater erupted violently. Quickly, they had to dive for cover to dodge the hailing rocks. When they realised that they were still alive, Oakley picked up his camera and resumed his filming. The raw images show the force of the eruption and the power and fury of Mother Nature in the aftermath. Thick, black, billowing smoke rising from the crater, an eerie sight to witness at such close range.
Okay, we just legged it back about 100 metres from over here. Pretty frightening, you have to leg it and look up at the same time.
Nearly half the population of Montserrat were evacuated from their homes because of fears a volcano may soon erupt. The Chances Peak volcano, whose last major eruption was more than 100 years ago, had been spewing dust and debris for about a month, raising concerns about a major eruption that could engulf the tiny Caribbean island. But though the volcano continued to spew gases and ash, no further intense activity followed, and there was no indication of when the volcano might erupt.
The scientists have told us that we have a safe zone on the island, that the northern top third of the island is safe. There's been quite a lot of hazard mapping in Montserrat in recent times. They're looking at the history going back 20,000 years, and the north end of the island has not been affected in previous volcanic eruptions.
Montserrat's emergency force remained on a heightened state of alert, with authorities evaluating once every 48 hours whether further evacuation was necessary.
Because we are living here in fear. It is fear here. Nobody knows what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and all we got to do here is pray and cooperate and help each other. That's how I'm seeing it.
Everybody here has seen that volcano cough and has seen a lot of ash cover their homes, and they're concerned.
While Montserrat's Chances Peak volcano continued to rumble on August 25, the island also had to prepare for a tropical storm, causing more concern for the tiny island's already displaced population. Authorities dismantled a tent city set up near the northern town of St. John's for evacuated residents.
We are not in an evacuation mode. Individuals who wish to leave can leave. They'll make their own arrangements. People have been leaving by commercial flights. That is going to continue. Liat, the regional airline, is putting on flights as required. So once there are people here, they'll be able to do that. Of course, there's a hurricane, but what we're doing, we're taking the tents down. We've been able to put the people in shelters, scattered in the safe zone.
March 1996, dome growth continued in English's crater, with hybrid earthquake swarms, small rock falls from the dome, minor pyroclastic flows, and continued slow deformation. This is also when pyroclastic flows were first observed in Tar River Valley. On May 12, 1996, flows reached the sea, and this happened repeatedly in the following months. Residents were waiting and preparing anxiously for a long siege, uncertain of their fate.
We're preparing for a long siege, but we're also prepared that something might happen quite devastating in the short term.
In June 1997, the first pyroclastic flows and rockfalls moved down the northern flanks of the volcano. On June 25, a major collapse, lasting about 20 minutes, releases large amounts of material in 3 pulses. Pyroclastic flows reach to within 50 metres of Bramble Airport, and ash cloud surges sweep over Ferrell's Plain. A surge-derived flow moves down the Balham River Valley as far as Cork Hill. 19 fatalities were recorded. By July 12, 1997, a pyroclastic flow had burned much of what was not already covered in ash in the town, and marks the start of the end for the capital city, Plymouth. A major dome collapse on August 3 sends flows through central Plymouth, with burning of buildings on the side of Fort Gort. The town is engulfed and the land ravished. August 4 to August 12, a series of 10 Volcanian explosions lasting 1 to 2 minutes occur approximately every 12 hours. Large flow lobe overtopped Fort Gort into Dagenham. Pumice flows run down drainage channels on the flanks. Ballistic blocks of 1 to 2 metre in diameter reach distances of 1.7 kilometres. The extrusion rate during this period is phenomenal, and a 300-metre diameter explosion crater is formed. September and December 1997 brings more dome growth, more explosions, more anxiety. December 25, 1997. a major hybrid earthquake swarm merges into a continuous tremor by the end of Christmas Day. The southwest flank of the volcano and the section of the dome in the Gulway Wall area suffers a massive collapse on December 26, and a debris avalanche cascades down the White River Valley. The dome is undermined and a high-energy pyroclastic surge sweeps out to sea, devastating southern Montserrat. This major collapse is referred to as the Boxing Day event. One fateful day, a pleasant city sitting beneath a dormant volcano was completely destroyed when the volatile pig rumbled to life. Sound familiar? Everyone knows the story of Pompeii in Italy, destroyed in AD 79 by Mount Vesuvius. Montserrat's capital, Plymouth, has been compared to a modern-day Pompeii. Many people who've heard of Pompeii don't realise that there were actually two cities that were destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Pompeii and Herculaneum. Both were completely covered by volcanic ash when Vesuvius belched volcanic ash and hot mud on August 24 in the year 79 AD. Now, after its accidental discovery in 1592, Pompeii has become a World Heritage Site, excavated by archaeologists to reveal many of the treasures of its ancient Roman heritage. Tourists flock to the site yearly and wander through the ruins, stepping back in time to experience the artifacts of the lost city. The homes of the wealthiest citizens in Pompeii revealed beautiful works of art, particularly frescoes, pictures painted on the walls using a specific technique, and a reverence for the local gods and goddesses. Volcanoes are not all alike. Vesuvius is what is known as a composite volcano. Composite volcanoes have two different types of eruptions. The kind you see in the movies, where the volcano spits molten lava, and the kind where the volcano spews ash and rock. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum was of the latter kind. Both cities were forgotten until they were found again in the 1700s. Over time, the cities became completely buried. Excavation, which is the process archaeologists use to dig up buried artifacts, has been underway for several hundred years. At Pompeii, there are still many, many areas yet to be uncovered. Pompeii, before the explosion, was a city of 20,000 residents. In many ways, it was very progressive. Pompeii had indoor running water, a thriving marketplace, an amphitheatre for entertainment, and a structured government. When Mount Vesuvius erupted near Pompeii, the ancient city was completely destroyed, buried by more than 60 feet of ash and pumice, and lost to civilization for more than 1,500 years. Eruptions from the Souvriere Hills volcano left residents doubting whether the island would ever return to its former existence as a holiday paradise. The plight of the Montserratians steadily worsened after an uneasy peace with the rumbling volcano over the years. Many inhabitants of Montserrat opted to remain on the island, hoping the Souvriere Hills volcano would not blow until they received a better resettlement deal from the British government, which was offered at the time.
Well, I just feel safe. I don't feel anything coming, Fritz.
Okay, did you just see the last eruptions that just happened?
Yes, yes.
Does it frighten you or worry you in any way?
No, no. Well, from the start, I've never been frightened at all. No, no. I'm not scared at all.
Are you planning on evacuating?
No, 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 no. Unless everybody leaving the island, I wouldn't be going. No.
London offered the Montserrat Islanders voluntary evacuation to Britain or other Caribbean islands, but became embroiled in an unseemly row over the level of assistance being offered. Only a trickle of people on Montserrat accepted the offer to leave, with many waiting to see whether Britain would make good on its pledge to make infrastructure developments in the unaffected north of the island, including the building of 250 homes.
We have to ensure that those who want to leave are able to do so, but equally the ones who want to stay, I'm hoping the British government will develop the island, will put in the infrastructure in the north to enable that community to remain on their island.
For others, such as Hilda and Raymond Blake, who owned the island's Brady Bunch Bar, in an area largely unaffected by the volcano, there is no choice. Hilda Blake explained they had no insurance because they had taken over the business in 1995, after the volcano became active again. And with nowhere to store their stock, they faced total losses if they left.
Well, so far when we took over the business in October 95, we could not even get an insurance because that volcano was had already started. So we have no insurance at all and everything is down to us. We wouldn't get anything from anybody.
More recently, Souvriere Hills volcano erupted again on January 18, 2010, when pyroclastic flows reached the sea via Ames Gort. Then, in February, another relentless explosion sent flows down several sides of the mountain, while a partial collapse of the lava dome belched ash clouds over neighbouring islands, Guadeloupe and Antigua. Ironically, the inhabited northern region of Montserrat remains largely undisturbed by the ash. Today, the lush green vegetation comprising most of Montserrat is a stark contrast to the ash-ravaged badlands around Plymouth and the volcano itself. A new airport in the north opened in 2008 to replace the original one, buried in the 1995 eruption. While Plymouth was once the only port of entry to Montserrat, a dock has been built at Little Bay, where the island's new capital is being constructed.